Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. Midterms are less than 60 days away, and the party in power seems unsure about its future. Over the weekend, the New York Times reported Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney suggested Republicans would fare better in midterm elections if President Trump wasn't so dominant in races. RNC Chair Ronna Romney McDaniel pushed back on that argument on Face the Nation.
The president has a 90% approval rating among Republicans. It's one of the highest in history for a president from his own party. And we have seen on the ground, as we bring the president into these races, like Montana, where he was this week, the candidates' numbers rise. We saw it with Matt Rosendale. We saw it in Ohio when Balderson was in a very tough race. We brought the president into Delaware County, and we saw him help propel that Election Day vote to victory. So the president is a great asset for us.
President Trump will visit Missouri on Thursday, where Republicans are hoping to flip a Senate seat held by Democrat Claire McCaskill. He canceled a trip to Mississippi on Friday because of Hurricane Florence. These stops may signal how the GOP is preparing for November 6th. While the president's party has an overwhelmingly favorable map this year, it has found itself facing competitive Senate candidates in several states that voted for Trump in 2016. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders held a briefing for the first time since August 22nd, and the first time since a scathing op-ed by an administration official was published in the New York Times. Sanders addressed it on Monday.
We're certainly focused on things that actually matter, and the staff here that is here to do their job and not undermine the great work that this president and this administration has done. And we're going to continue focusing on that. It's frankly, I think, sad and pathetic that a gutless, anonymous source could receive so much attention from the media. And I think that the American people would be much better served if we actually spent some time talking about some of the really important things that are facing our country and the things that this administration is doing to help fix them.
But it's not just the media paying attention to the op-ed. President Trump called it treason in an interview last week, and on Twitter questioned if the official even existed. Gabe Debenedetti and Caitlin Huey-Burns are here. Gabe is a national correspondent for New York Magazine, and Caitlin is a newly minted CBSN political reporter. We are so thrilled to have you. Welcome to you both. Caitlin, let me start with you. This is the last week of primaries before midterms, and control of Congress, of course, is on the line. It's interesting because President Trump tweeted recently that Republicans are, quote, doing really well with the Senate midterms. He did not, however, tweet about the House. So how should we interpret that?
Right. Well, we know the maps are very different. We know Republicans have a better shot at some of these Senate races. 10 states that Democrats are trying to hold on to, of course, that Donald Trump, in states that Donald Trump won, 5 of them overwhelmingly. But we are seeing polls tighten in some of them, and we're also starting to see some really competitive races in some red states, Arizona, of course, Tennessee, and possibly Texas as well. So what the president is doing here is trying to kind of paint a picture that Republicans are doing well. He is very popular among Republicans, but it's there is also this concern that he is not ringing enough alarm bells here, that he needs to rally his base even more to turn out for Republicans down the ballot. Presidents typically have a difficult time doing that. President Obama was a good example. I don't think it'll be that different for President Trump. And so you have strategists and operatives saying that, you really need to take this seriously. You need to be raising the money. You need to be out there. You needed to have started this campaign a long time ago, while the president is talking about a red wave that not many Republicans think is going to exist.
You're nodding your head, Gabe.
Yeah, it's not just that many Republicans don't agree with the president. The president is basically the only one saying this publicly for good reason, because the polling simply shows that that's not going to happen. And it's not just the House, as Caitlin said. The House, many people are privately saying, is essentially gone for Republicans, or at least very close to that. But there are a lot of people, unbiased and partisan alike, who are saying that the Senate is in serious trouble for Republicans now, let alone all these governor's races. You mentioned earlier that the president just canceled a rally in Mississippi. If the president has to go to a rally in Mississippi for a Senate race, then that means that the Senate is in trouble, period.
Right. And so let's go back to the House for a moment. RNC Chair Ronna McDaniel talked about the future of the House on Face the Nation. Let's play some of what she said about that.
On the House, we have a lot of seats in the margin. Absolutely. We've had an unprecedented amount of retirements, and that has made it harder in some of these swing districts. But right now, I'd say it's 50-50.
All right. So, Gabe, what does that sound like to you?
Yeah, retirements don't just happen because people decide that they don't want to be around anymore. A lot of them are retiring because they know they're going to lose their seats.
Right.
She says it's 50-50. Fine. That would be a pretty historic win for Democrats. I'm not saying that Democrats are absolutely going to win the House, but yeah, Republicans are absolutely getting ready. They're trying to tell people, listen, the House is in serious trouble, and if you're not going to step up now, maybe it's too late.
So, yeah, I mean, Caitlin, what did you hear in that answer there from Ronna McDaniel? Is this a case of basically acknowledging the political reality or trying to sound the bell or both, basically?
Well, what's really interesting here is that they're shifting their optimism to the Senate, but, you know, the House is where the impeachment proceedings would likely start, of course. And the president has been talking a lot about impeachment lately, kind of trying to send a warning to his base voters, but also to kind of softer Republicans or even independent voters who may not want to spend the next 2 years wrapped up in this gridlock and impeachment proceedings, perhaps, or you know, the subpoena power that Democrats would have by gaining control of the House. That is very significant here. Mm-hmm. And you're hearing Republicans talk about it in campaigns, and you're hearing the president talk about it. If Democrats are to take over the House, even if they keep the Senate, even if Republicans keep the Senate, that presents a whole host of problems for the president and his agenda. So they can't just paper over it and act like it's a foregone conclusion, even though polls show and we know from reporting that it's on its way.
I mean, Gabe, is it problematic? We heard the president at the top there sounding very optimistic. But if you're a Republican and you're hearing the president sound this sort of optimistic, confident tone, doesn't that basically go at odds with what it is you are trying to do, which is to get voters out to the polls?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think if you're a Republican running for re-election with very few, exceptions at this point, they know that they're just going to have to deal with what the president says, and things might be looking good for them on one front, but they can't predict what he's going to say. And so most of them have really just tried to steer clear. So when you have Ronna McDaniel talking about bringing the president in as many places as possible, that's really only in very specific, hyper-targeted ways, or when the president decides he wants to go into a place and they can't say no to him. That's why you have all these Republicans tiptoeing around him, and you have Democrats saying, come on down.
Right. So let me follow up on that, Caitlin. If you're a Democrat, how are you now prepping for this possibility, right, that come November, you will be in charge of the House?
Well, what's really interesting is that Democrats, of course, know that President Trump likes to be out on the campaign trail. And one element of that is that you can't really target President Trump's approach. And so you send him to a specific district or a specific state. It's not like he is going to be contained in that district or state. He can have whatever he says will have ripple effects for Republicans across the country, up and down the ballot. Democratic candidates, as Gabe and I were just discussing earlier, they're not talking about impeachment. They're trying to stick to the issues. Of course, health care is still a major driver for Democratic voters and for something that Democratic candidates are talking about. Look at the ad released by Joe Manchin, who is running for Senate in West Virginia, incumbent, running for re-election, talking about saving the Affordable Care Act and going after his opponent for wanting to dismantle it and pre-existing conditions that would come along with that. That's a big deal. He's not talking about impeachment. There is enthusiasm, of course, around opposition to Trump among the base. So that's something that candidates are dealing with, but you're hearing it more so from the Republican side.
Because what's that calculus if you're a Democrat, Gabe? Because on the one hand, you know that anti-Trump rhetoric is what fires up the base, but you also know at the same time that Democrats have been criticized in the past for not having a vision beyond just opposing President Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it really depends on the district that we're talking about here. You look at someone like Joe Manchin. He's running in West Virginia. That's a state that Donald Trump won by 42 points in 2016. He knows that he's not going to talk about Donald Trump, and Donald Trump, frankly, likes Joe Manchin and is not going to talk much about him. So really, in a state like that, you're going to see them focus a lot on health care. There are certainly places where Democrats are talking about opposition to Trump, and in Democratic primaries, when they're really trying to rile up the base, that's what they're talking about more than anything else. But once it gets to the general election, Democrats now realize at this point that their base voters are likely going to be with them because so far all indications are that they're historically energized in this midterms. So they're not talking about impeachment. They're not even talking about investigations. Back on Capitol Hill, Democratic leadership is preparing for months and months of investigations. But on the trail, what you really see candidates talk about, as Caitlin said, is health care, gun control, the economy, really basic issues here.
So it was interesting to see former President Obama jumping into the fray. He hit the campaign trail last week, and here's some of what he said about the state of politics right now.
Sometimes the backlash comes from people who are genuinely, if wrongly, fearful of change. More often, it's manufactured by the powerful and the privileged who want to keep us divided and keep us angry and keep us cynical because that helps them maintain the status quo and keep their power and keep their privilege. And you happen to be coming of age during one of those moments. It did not start with Donald Trump. He is a symptom, not the cause.
All right, so Caitlin, I mean, is there a balance, essentially, that former President Obama has to try to strike here? Because obviously the goal for him is to help energize Democrats, but one could argue, just as President Trump energizes the opposition, so too could former President Obama.
Exactly. There are going to be a lot of Democrats that want to see Obama out on the campaign trail and campaigning for them. There's going to be a lot of Republicans who will want the same thing because of that kind of energizing force and ability to kind of use him as a foil. I think it's important to point out, though, that unlike former presidents, Obama left office with good approval ratings. He's still popular, and he's extremely popular among the Democratic base. He did not get involved in these primaries. Now we're coming to the end of primary season this Thursday, of course. So we'll see him out on the campaign trail more. He was campaigning in California, of course, where there are a couple of competitive seats in red districts. Democrats want to see him out there. The president, of course, the current president, is already talking about Obama, saying he fell asleep, listening to him and kind of using him as a punching bag, trying to rev up his base again.
So, Gabe, as we watched former President Obama out there, it certainly brought to mind, obviously, like echoes of campaigns past. But I want to ask you specifically about this because it's interesting. Your piece here, Where is Barack Obama? We look at the difference between what we saw last week and then this sort of absence. What has changed between, the time that we didn't actually see him commenting, responding in any way, shape, or form to this particular moment?
Yeah, well, when I wrote this story just a few months ago, this was a question that a lot of Democrats were asking, which is, how come the former president, isn't out there helping us resist? That's what the Democrats were asking now, at the time. But now what you're hearing from a lot of them is essentially, well, now it's time. Now it is absolutely time. And President Obama himself is saying, listen, now that it's campaign season, he's going to hold a number of very targeted events. The reason that he hasn't been talking up against Donald Trump more is precisely what you were just talking about, that he doesn't want this backlash. He knows that Republicans are not always united right now, but one thing that really does unite them is opposition to him, and he doesn't want Trump to make his base any more consolidated than it really is. That clip that we just saw was the first time that President Obama has even said Trump's name in public since leaving office. That's something that, is a little factoid that drives the Obama folks crazy because they don't like the idea that just saying his name gives him so much power. But that is realistically what Obama's been doing, holding back, letting other Democrats rise up, but saying now that people are paying attention to campaign season, he's going to go in a very targeted way, try to not have too much of a backlash, but try and energize Democrats where he can.
So even as we're focusing on November, Gabe, I know you've also been reporting on 2020, because it's never too early to start talking about 2020. Ever. And not just on the Democratic side, you write that a primary challenge is growing more likely for President Trump. What would that look like? Well,
that is the big question. It's certainly true, based on a lot of Republicans that I've been talking to, particularly in New Hampshire, where this is likely to happen, the state that's so friendly to insurgencies, that someone is going to challenge the president. The real question is whether this person will have any shot of winning whatsoever. And so far, the consensus is basically not really. But what this kind of challenge might do is demonstrate to folks that the Republican Party is not necessarily 100% behind Donald Trump, though it is, of course, about 80 or 90% of the way there. And it might demonstrate that he has some weaknesses that they then might, spin forward into the general election. So there are a number of people who are looking at this right now. And the question are, you have someone like John Kasich, who's the current Ohio governor, Jeff Flake and Ben Sasse, two senators who've been kind of critical of the president, are people who are often talked about. And then you have some Republican activists who are trying to draft other people into running. essentially to send a message and say, we can do better than this, or this is not our only option here. It's a really, really big uphill climb, though.
I think about those names, Caitlin, and I think about the sometimes criticism that has been lobbed at them, that while their rhetoric may be in stark opposition to the president, when you look at their actual records of votes taken, that they very much, by their actions, stand with President Trump. Could that be potentially problematic for them?
Well, they're still Republicans. And, as much as Democrats want kind of anybody who is critical or resistant to Trump and his rhetoric and ideology, at the end of the day, these folks are still Republicans. They're not going to necessarily become Democrats. What's interesting is that on paper, the president looks ripe for a challenge, but he's still very popular among Republicans, and we've seen, there's a reason that Jeff Flake isn't running for re-election in Arizona. The other big question mark I have is how the midterm results color all of this, right? So if it is a devastating election for Republicans, will Trump remain as popular with Republican voters? I think there's a lot to be seen between now and then, although it's not too early, because around this time next year we'll be in debate season.
I know. Well, but 90% approval rating for President Trump among Republicans, Gabe.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine anybody else sort of being able to capture that kind of support right now.
Absolutely. And actually, to go a little bit into the weeds here for 1 second, that's one of the reasons that a lot of folks are focusing on New Hampshire, because the primary there is open, which means that independents and Democrats can also vote in a primary. Now, very few of these people actually think that Donald Trump is susceptible to losing a primary there, but even a surprisingly strong showing from someone historically can really weaken an incumbent president. That's happened a few times in our history, and that's why you have some people who are sort of students of the primary in New Hampshire, which of course is the second state to vote in a process like this, sort of trying to say, well, maybe Kasich can do it. Maybe Flake can do it. Maybe we can try and convince some other congressman to do it.
Well, we know, though, that President Trump is an incumbent unlike any other incumbent president we've seen, though. Very much an X factor at this point. All right, Gabe Debenedetti, Caitlin Huey-Burns, great to have you both on set. Let's make this a habit.
Absolutely.